Hello, everybody. This is the beginning of the Section 3 video from Chapter 12, and today we're going to be talking about Election Day and the voters. So there will be 3 questions from this section on the quiz, and they're going to be true or false statements. So pay attention during the video for these questions to have ready for the quiz on Thursday. So the chapter or the section begins with a case study looking at the election of 2000. It was a pretty historic election night, and that is because instead of knowing that night who the next president of the United States of America was, um, citizens had to wait about a month to find out who their next president was. So the results hinged on which candidate won Florida and its 25 electoral votes. So one of the biggest phrases I remember from this time was hanging chads or pregnant chads. And basically what ended up happening was that the election was really quite close, and the news media kept calling it for different people back and forth. So first they said, yay, we're calling Florida for president or for Al Gore. And then they said, no, never mind. We're calling it for George Bush. And then it went back to Gore. And it was really confusing. And the next morning when we woke up, it turns out that it was just too close to call. It was within, I think, 1,500 votes out of 6 million. And so what ended up happening was that President Gore, I don't know why I'm calling him President Gore. He was not a president. He was the vice president, guys. Sorry about that. Vice President Gore said that because it was so close, he felt that it ought to trigger a recount. And so what ended up happening is that Gore took it to the courts in the state of Florida and initially won. However, the Bush campaign appealed the ruling, and it made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which issued a ruling saying that because of the way that the motions were initially filed, um, it was actually not okay for the Supreme Court's Florida Supreme Court's order to have a recount. That was not all right. And so at that point, Gore finally accepted defeat, and President Bush went on to win this election. Um, this was pretty historic for a lot of reasons. One, the election was ultimately decided by an incredibly small number of voters. Two, it took about a month to find out who even won. And three, the decision went all the way to the Supreme Court. So that was a pretty historic night. Here is George Bush and his father and his brother waiting for results on election night. And here is Al Gore speaking to the press on the day after the election. This is what the electoral map looked like during the election. So as you can see, it was a pretty close election. Those 25 votes from Florida made all the difference. So we want to talk in this section about political participation. So basically, the United States is a democratic republic, and we are a nation in which our power belongs to the people. So it's really important that people are as informed as possible. And the main way that citizens interact um, with the political process is actually through voting. So there's many ways to participate. The main way is voting, but you can also be informed about issues. You can volunteer in different campaigns. You can contribute money to different campaigns, or you can even run for office yourself. So let's see. There's a lot of information here. I would like to keep this video short, so let's go ahead and just really quickly work through this. Voting rights have been extended several times in U.S. history. We know that it was extended after the Civil War to African Americans, freed slaves. We know that that it was extended in 1920 to include women. But we can't say that everybody truly was gaining the right to vote until after the civil rights movement. So, one thing that's kind of interesting is um, despite the fact that we're a democracy, we have probably the lowest voter turnout of all democracies in the world. The textbook asserts this. It's just a really interesting situation. There's a lot of different reasons that could account for that. But basically, despite the fact that we've had to fight so hard for everybody to have the right to vote, not many people do. And so that's why we have classes like this one, because we want you guys to understand the process. We want you guys to get passionate about politics, and we want you guys to exercise your right to vote. So, one thing that's kind of an interesting piece of information here, and it is actually a question on your quiz. I'm going to state the fact and then let you know what your quiz says. So, in the 2008 presidential election, about 3/4 of those age 65 and older went to the polls to vote. Okay, age 65 and older, 3/4 went to vote. And in voters younger than 25, fewer than 60% turned out to vote. So we have a situation here in which young voters do not turn out in the same numbers as older voters. On your quiz, question number 8, it's a true-false question, and it says, although nearly 3/4 of voters younger than 25 voted in 2004, less than half of voters older than 65 turned out to vote. So on your quiz, we would know that this is in fact false because it is the older demographic that turns out in higher numbers to vote. So there's a lot of things that you can do to become involved in the political process, working on campaigns, working the polls, or becoming a candidate yourself. All of this in addition to voting. The voting process has a few different steps. All right. Before I continue, I just realized there's a next question I want to give you that's on the quiz. It says, working on political campaigns is the main means by which most Americans participate in the political process. This statement is actually false. It is actually voters, it is actually voting that is the means by which most Americans participate in the political process. Most Americans aren't donating money and volunteering at campaigns or running for office. Most Americans who choose to get involved do so by exercising their right to vote. So this is really important, and make sure you remember that for your quiz. So the steps to voting are pretty simple. There's a really cute little picture diagram on page 382 in your text. So the very first step of the voting process is to learn about the candidates and to inform yourself about the issues. Next, you register to vote. So in many states, you must register to vote a specific number of days before Election Day. It's not common to have same-day voter registration. And it's the states that are responsible for this. It's not the job of the federal government. Okay. Next, you'll choose a political party affiliation. So you can choose to be a Republican or a Democrat. You can even choose to be independent. You can register as a third party, a member of the third party, a small party like the Green Party or Libertarian Party. One thing that's a little bit frustrating actually is in the state of California, we don't have a truly open primary system. So, for example, if you are interested in voting for a Democratic candidate in the primaries in next year, you must be registered as a Democrat or as an independent. I actually am registered as a third party um, a member of a third party. So in the last election, I actually couldn't participate in the primaries. I could participate in my own party's primary, but it was frustrating because that was not the exciting party with the exciting candidates and exciting decisions to make. So just be aware of that. It actually can be a big benefit to you to be registered as an independent in California, in that you can choose which primary you want to vote in. So um, in in the United States, we believe very strongly in one person, one vote. And because of this, we have a few different things that we do. And the first is reapportionment, which we've discussed previously in other chapters. And this is a redistribution of congressional seats due to population changes. It's why we have our census every 10 years. Second, we believe we participate in something called redistricting. So new boundaries are drawn for legislative districts so that each district has roughly the same amount of people in it. For example, if one district had 500,000 people and another district had only 5,000 people, there'd be a pretty big difference there, and um, each district is represented by one person. And so if one guy, person A, is representing a 500,000 people, okay, and person B is representing 5,000 people, right? The second district is going to have better representation. So we um, redistrict based on these numbers to keep things as fair as possible. On the actual day of the election, there's a lot of things that are going on. Um, so by this point, the campaign should know a few very important things. First, they need to know where the candidate has strong support. They need to know where the candidate's opponent is very strong. And they need to know the places where voting can go either way. And what ends up happening is you see a lot of efforts being made on election day to continue to get people out to vote. So, like I said in section 1, it's uncommon for somebody to try to be convincing people to change their mind. And instead, it's more common for a candidate to try to encourage people just to come out and vote altogether. So sometimes you have people offering to drive voters to the polls. Other times you have, people passing out stickers and different things encouraging people to vote. It's actually not allowed to be campaigning at a polling location. So you might see signs or candidates standing like a few hundred feet away from the actual polling sites to try to get people to participate. There's also big efforts to get the vote out. So your book calls it GOTV, or getting out the vote. And these are efforts that a campaign makes on election day to try to get people out to vote. So this is a way for citizens to maintain the continuity of a representative democracy. It's really important for every person to have the chance to vote. Otherwise, your voice just isn't heard, right? So the telephone is the basic tool of getting out the vote. So there are robocalls that are made. There are people who might actually volunteer for a campaign to call in person. All of these things are done to try to get as many people out to vote as possible. And here's that cute little infographic I was telling you about, the different steps to voting. So here, she's researching her candidates, trying to figure out how she's going to vote. Here she goes to register to vote. She chooses a party, and then finally she goes to her polls to vote. And notice, or not notice, keep in mind, this cannot happen as the same day as this. That's why she is in a different outfit in this infographic. That's the end of this lecture. I want to go over the quiz. Let's see, question number 6. It says, until 1971, no U.S. citizen under the age of 21 could vote, and this is true. That was the only question I hadn't gone over with you. Make sure you listen to these videos very carefully for these questions. I will be giving you the quiz at the beginning of class on Thursday, so make sure you're prepared. If you have any questions in the meantime, reach out to me. Thank you for listening to these videos. I'm not very good at talking to a TV. I'm much better at actually talking to y'all in person. So thank you for participating in this experiment with me. And here's to hoping that these videos eventually make it up on YouTube. That's the next difficulty. But have a great one, y'all.